So welcome back, everybody. Our final workshop is entitled Legislative Advocacy, Developments at the Federal, State, and Local Levels. I'm Bob Moore, and I'm pleased to be joined for this workshop by Michelle Chappell and Terri Robl. By way of introduction, I'm the Vice Chair of Pax Christi Metro DC-Baltimore, and I'm also the coordinator of a local Pax Christi group at my parish, St. John Neumann in Reston, Virginia. I'm a member of the Pax Christi USA Working Group on Gun Violence Prevention, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the DC Area Interfaith Gun Violence Prevention Network. I'm retired from a career as an attorney with the Department of the Interior. Michelle Chappell is the legislative lead for the DC chapter of Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America. A Texan by birth, she was raised in a military family and attended Southern Methodist University. She then received her JD from Georgetown University and made Washington her home. After a career in corporate litigation, she pursued her dream of advocating for gun violence prevention. When she's not analyzing policy proposals and meeting with politicians and community leaders, she's busy keeping up with her two young daughters and trying to predict the next top chef. Terri Robl is a retired diplomat with over 30 years experience as a State Department Foreign Service officer, representing the United States interests in Washington, Paris, Brussels, Djibouti, Pretoria, and at the United Nations in New York. She's a volunteer with the Maryland chapter of Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America, who focuses on Maryland legislative initiatives to reduce gun violence. So I'm going to start us off with developments at the federal level and then turn it over to Michelle and Terri. In talking about developments at the federal level, I'm going to talk about recent and pending Supreme Court cases, which of course have a big impact on what we can and can't do to promote gun safety. And then I'll talk about recent and pending legislation in Congress and one significant administrative action by the Biden administration. Finally, I'll talk quickly about advocacy opportunities at the federal level. The starting point is the Second Amendment and what it means. For most of the nation's history, it was interpreted as applying to military units organized and regulated by governments. However, in 2008, the Supreme Court held for the first time that the Second Amendment confers a private right of gun ownership, the position advocated by gun rights groups like the National Rifle Association. 2 years later, the Supreme Court extended its ruling in Heller to the states through the 14th Amendment. In Catano, the court took an expansive view of what arms are covered by the Second Amendment, in that case, a stun gun. And in 2022, the court issued the Bruin decision, laying out a test that a firearm regulation would have to meet to be permissible under its interpretation, the court's interpretation of the Second Amendment. The government must demonstrate that the regulation is consistent with the nation's historical tradition of firearm regulation. The standard is whether a modern regulation imposes a burden on the right of armed self-defense that's comparable to historical regulations. To pass muster, the government must identify a well-established and representative historical analog, though not an historical twin, the court wrote. 3 pending Supreme Court cases, 2 of which are expected to be decided next month and a third next year, will greatly affect what can be done by Congress, state legislatures, and the executive branch to regulate guns. In the wake of the Bruin decision, lower courts have struggled to apply this historical tradition test, evaluating arguments based on historical analogs or lack thereof. In United States versus Rahimi, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals struck down a 1996 federal law prohibiting someone with a domestic violence restraining order from possessing a firearm. The court reasoned that domestic violence wasn't a crime in the 1780s when the Second Amendment was adopted, or the 1860s when the 14th Amendment was ratified. Rahimi gives the court an opportunity to clarify application of its Bruin decision. Garland versus Cargill is not a Second Amendment case under Bruin, but a case of statutory interpretation and the authority of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. In 2018, the ATF promulgated a rule banning bump stocks, which had been used by the shooter in the horrific 2017 mass shooting in Las Vegas. The Fifth Circuit struck down the rule as exceeding the ATF's authority under the National Firearms Act. We can expect widespread coverage of these two cases and their implications when the decisions are issued later this month or more probably in June. The third case, Garland versus Vanderstock, was recently added to the court's docket for the 2024-2025 term. It's another case involving statutory interpretation and the authority of the ATF. Once again, the Fifth Circuit invalidated a federal rule, this time one concerning ghost guns. Switching to legislative developments, political gridlock in Congress has generally prevented the passage of significant legislation at the federal level, such as the uniform background checks and assault weapons ban. But in June 2022, Congress did pass the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which did several things. It provided funding for state extreme risk protection order laws, community violence interruption programs, mental health services, and school safety. It prohibited current or former dating partners convicted of domestic violence from possessing firearms. It enhanced background checks for gun buyers under 21. It clarified who is required to obtain a federal firearms license and conduct background checks on gun sales. And it prohibited interstate gun trafficking. A January 2023 Washington Post article helps to explain the gridlock. Entitled "Gun Owners Favor Requiring Parents to Lock Up Weapons, It's Lawmakers Who Don't," the article noted that 2/3 of gun owners support safe storage requirements, but GOP lawmakers have been warned that if they support any gun legislation, they will be primaried by the gun lobby. So if fear of the gun lobby and its campaign spending prevents Republicans from supporting even mild regulation like safe storage requirements, progress on more controversial measures is impossible in a divided Congress or state legislature. But in some states like Maryland, where Democrats control the legislature and the governorship, some progress is possible. This slide and the next list 5 significant bills pending in Congress, none of which has a single Republican co-sponsor. The assault weapons ban is co-sponsored by 206 of the 212 Democrats in the House and 45 of the 51 Democrats and independents in the Senate. Ethan's Law, which would prohibit any person from keeping a firearm unsecured on their premises if they reasonably expect that a minor or a resident who cannot lawfully possess a firearm may gain access to that firearm, likewise has broad support among Democrats and independents. The same is true for the Universal Background Check bill. The Equal Access to Justice for Victims of Gun Violence Act would repeal the 2005 Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, also known as PLACA, which shields gun manufacturers and sellers from liability for the unlawful use of their products. PLACA is subject to limited exceptions, but it otherwise prevents lawsuits to hold the gun industry accountable for its disregard for public safety. As you see, this bill has less support than the previous ones. Finally, the Break the Cycle of Violence Act could use many more co-sponsors. I mentioned earlier ATF rules banning bump stocks and regulating ghost guns involved in those Fifth Circuit decisions. Last month, the ATF issued an even more significant rule, greatly expanding the category of gun sellers who are required to register as federally licensed firearms dealers and run background checks on gun sales. The rule implements one of the provisions of the 2022 Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. It's expected to add some 23,000 gun dealers to the 80,000 already registered by the ATF. The rule is currently being challenged in court, including by 21 red states, although it's hard to see how they're adversely affected. In light of the congressional gridlock, none of the 5 bills listed above will become law this Congress, but it's important to show broad public support for these measures and to encourage as many representatives and senators as possible to co-sponsor them. Co-sponsors and supportive candidates for Congress can then point to them to distinguish their positions from their opponents and hopefully move the needle toward greater gun safety. These next several slides show how you can take action. First, you need to know if your representative or senators are currently co-sponsoring the bills. If they're Republicans, they haven't, and you should write them to make your position known. If they're Democrats or independents, you should check the list of co-sponsors first. You have to search separately for the House and Senate versions of each bill. Go to www.congress.gov and type the bill number in the search bar at the top with no periods or spaces, for example, HR 660. Notice that the box on the left should say Current Congress. On the search results page, click on the bill number, which will bring up this page, which has a summary of the bill, text, actions, etc., and click on the co-sponsors tab. On this page, you can sort the list by last name or state and check to see if your representatives or senators have co-sponsored. If they haven't, go to their websites and submit a comment asking them to co-sponsor the bill. I have Jerry Connolly's comment page up here. He's my representative, and I like how the comment page for his website shows him meeting with a bunch of Moms Demand Action folks. He's already a co-sponsor on all the bills listed above but the last one, and I've written him about that one. Of course, if your representative or senators have co-sponsored one or more of the bills, you can write them to thank them. So thanks for your attention. I'll be happy to answer any questions in the time that remains, and you can contact me by email if you want to follow up on anything I covered. So if you'd like to raise a question, use the raise hand feature in the toolbar where you have reactions, and I'll be able to call on you then. Hey, Bob Cook.
Hey, Bob, thank you very much for your presentation. That was great. So 2 things. Will you be able to send out your PowerPoint to the folks who are registered if they want to, share any of that information with other people?
Sure.
Okay, and I just had a question for you and anybody else here. Is there anything we can do about the Supreme Court and the way, they're interpreting these cases besides hoping that we get better justices on the Supreme Court? But do you have any ideas about what possibly could be done until that point to hopefully get some better decisions?
Probably as a practical matter, no. But I don't think that should stop us. I think we should push back against their interpretation of the Second Amendment and reject the notion that it was ever intended to do what the Heller decision says, which is create this private right of gun ownership for self-defense. That's not consistent with the wording and history of the amendment. And I don't think we should take that as a given. So by analogy, when the Supreme Court issued the Roe v. Wade decision, the Catholic Church and a lot of other people didn't take it for granted that the Supreme Court has spoken. That's the end of it. There must be a constitutional right to abortion. They got organized and lobbied as hard as they could, wherever they could, to get that interpretation reversed and said it was a wrong interpretation of the Constitution. I think that's what we should do with the Heller decision and its progeny, Bruin, et cetera. I'm a little bit hopeful that the Rahimi decision will pare back some of the worst implications of the Bruin decision, because I think in oral argument for the Rahimi case, it seemed that a number of the judges were prepared to uphold the regulation that had been struck down by the Fifth Circuit. So maybe we'll get a little more clarity at least, and hopefully not quite so radical approach to invalidating gun regulation in the future.
Great, thank you.
Could I just chime in there for a second? Terry, I'll be talking to you in a minute about Maryland. With respect to the Supreme Court, I know that there are often demonstrations in front of the court when there are decisions that affect us. But of course, that doesn't necessarily affect the decisions that are made on the inside. But the one thing that can affect those decisions eventually is there are projects where people are going and looking at legislation and what the laws were back in the day, because there's so much emphasis on what were the people thinking when they made these laws originally, around Civil War times and whatever. And they're finding examples of you can't carry guns here, or, this was the law in this state, and et cetera. And so there is an effort underway to do research so that you can actually say to the people that have this notion of, it has to be what the law was or what people thought back in the day when they were doing the original legislation, to counter that. Thanks.
Yeah. Great point, Terry. Thank you. Okay. Well, at this point, then, let me turn things over to Michelle, and she can fill us in on developments in DC. And Michelle, give me a minute, and I'll pull up your slides.
Okay, thanks. While he's pulling up the slides, I'll say hi, everybody. I'm Michelle Chappell, and I am the legislative lead for Mom's Demand in DC. And I think Terry's going to talk a little more in her presentation about who we are as an organization, if you're not familiar with us. But I'm going to focus on what's happening and what has been happening recently in DC. It's been a very active year for public safety and gun prevention. And just off the bat, I will say that DC has some of the strongest gun laws in the country. We don't have a single gun store within our jurisdiction, so most of the gun violence here is caused by guns coming in from outside, many of them illegally trafficked from states that have weaker gun laws. So what happens in other states very much affects the level of crime and gun violence in DC. If we could go to the next slide, please. Just an overview of what I'm going to talk about. First, I'm going to quickly talk about the structure of DC government and how legislation gets passed here because it's a unique place. And then next I'll cover last summer's emergency crime bill and the Secure DC Omnibus, which was a huge bill that was just passed. And then I'll talk about some stalled legislation that Moms Demand would very much support, but hasn't been able to move forward. And then finally, some promising developments on the prevention front. Next slide, please. So in DC, we have, since we are not a state, we operate more like a town or a city in terms of our legislation. We have, our legislature is the DC Council, and then they pass laws, and then the mayor has 10 days to either sign or veto them. And then the council, like a legislature, can override that veto if a law is vetoed. But then here's where DC is different than any other place in the country, is that once that is done, there's another layer, and that is we have congressional oversight of our legislation. So Congress can, within 30 days, block any laws that are passed in DC. And this is very relevant to what I'm going to talk about. And then the president has the final say on local DC laws. The president can either sign or veto the congressional block of our legislation. So no other place in the country has to think about directly like what Congress people in other parts of the country think of the laws that might be passed here. Next slide, please. So this brings us to what has happened in the last year, which led to the emergency crime bill and the Secure DC Omnibus. Next slide, please. So last year, 2023, in most parts of the country, crime was going down, but in DC, we had a rising homicide rate and rising violent crime. We had homicides last year were up 36% to the biggest number in over 20 years. There were 274 people killed in DC last year, and 19 of those people were children. There were younger and younger children being involved in criminal activity. We had 12 and 13-year-olds carjacking people while armed. And at the same time, the DC Council passed the revised criminal code, which had been a years-long effort to kind of rationalize our criminal code system. And it also includes some things that Moms Demand supported, like a new law against firing a firearm in public. But because the code reduced some maximum sentences, and because crime was rising in DC, the House Republicans thought it would be a time to be tough on crime and block this revised criminal code act. So we were left with rising crime and no new code to kind of address it. And that led to a whole flurry of public safety proposals from the mayor and from a handful of council members that came up with competing ideas about what the city should do to deal with this issue. And that culminated in an emergency bill last July that mainly focused on incarceration, did not have a lot of prevention in it. And then throughout the fall, Brooke Pinto, who is the chair of the Public Safety Committee, looked at all of the proposals and came up with an omnibus bill. We can go to the next slide, which was over 100 pages long, combined many, many different ideas about what should happen. And there's no time to address most of what was in the bill, but I will focus on what the gun violence prevention provisions were that we hope will be effective in reducing the gun violence rate. The first is firearms tracing, and this was part of the emergency bill as well. And this is a provision that requires MPD to come out with an annual report of all recovered crime guns showing their last known point of sale or transfer. And this is important because, like I said, our guns are not being bought locally. They're coming in from outside. So having a report that shows where all these individual guns can be traced back to could help us go after bad actors in the gun industry. If there's a gun store in Virginia or in North Carolina that is sending hundreds of guns to DC. We want to know that. The next provision is biweekly shooting reviews by the MPD and the deputy mayor for public safety and justice, because one of the issues in DC often with public safety is lack of communication between different parts of the government. So every 2 weeks they come together and discuss what has happened with shootings to try to see what can be done to better police areas or to better prevent crime in the future. There were also some good expansions of our ERPRO, our red flag law. The omnibus expanded the people who can report someone for an ERPO to include former romantic partners, not just current romantic partners, and also any law enforcement officer, not just MPD, because DC has many different law enforcement agencies that operate within our district. And finally, there were some data publishing requirements about the effectiveness of different diversion programs and the effectiveness of pretrial detention and what that has to do with recidivism. And Mom's Demand is very much evidence-based. Anything that requires more data, we are for more and more data to find out what works and what doesn't. Okay, next slide, please. So next, I'm going to talk about some legislation that has not made it past the kind of council committee level. Next slide, please. So these are the bills that missed the omnibus, unfortunately, and bills that we think would really have an impact on crime, on gun crime in DC. The first was the Evidence-Based Gun Violence Reduction and Prevention Act. And this would implement a focused deterrence plan known as the Group Violence Intervention Initiative. And this has been implemented in dozens of cities across the country to great effect. One of the best recent examples is Baltimore. Baltimore introduced a similar program in January of 2022, and 18 months later, the estimate by the city is that it was responsible for reducing homicides and shootings by about 25%. So they're very effective programs. They're basically a focused deterrence plan identifies individuals who are at highest risk for perpetrating violent crime. And often those are people who have already committed or have been victimized by gun violence. And it provides wraparound services to try to do everything possible that just basically throw resources at these people so that they do not choose the path of violence. And the second bill that we really we're looking forward to see passed that has been stalled out in committee is the establishment of reasonable controls for the firearm industry. And this, you heard Bob talk earlier about PLACA at the federal level. So this would be our version of a law to kind of override PLACA and allow the DC AG or individuals in DC to sue firearm industry members that are selling abnormally dangerous products or failing to prevent gun trafficking. Next slide, please. Okay, but we do have promising developments in DC coming up. This is kind of post-omnibus. A lot of the council members at the passage of the omnibus, I kind of acknowledged that we needed to do more to get to the root causes of violence, and that a lot of the provisions in the omnibus were not preventive enough in nature. So next slide, please. So the upcoming focus in the legislature, in the council, is going to be a focus on youth intervention. One of the Safer Today, Safer Tomorrow is a package of bills that would expand vocational education and establish a professional youth mentorship program. This is very much a gun violence prevention bill because a lot of what we hear from a lot of the youth that get involved in crime, they just don't see a future for themselves. And they really need support. They really need a path where they feel like they have a future so that they choose a different path in life. A second bill is the Chronic Absenteeism and Truancy Reduction Amendment Act. And this would address safe passage to schools, especially in schools that have a high rate of chronic absenteeism. Absenteeism is out of control in DC. In the last school year, in high school, among high school kids, there were over 50% chronically absent. And in schools where there are really high rates of chronic absenteeism, it's often a matter of either transportation to school or kids actually feeling unsafe going to and from school. So Safe Passage provides workers that have a presence outside the school and sometimes at metro stops or bus stops so that they can kind of diffuse any conflict that might be brewing and help kids get to school safely. The bill would also expand one's leadership academies, which is a program in middle schools and high schools that provides mentorship. It provides conflict resolution skills and things that really have been helpful for our young people. And also just an extra budget to fight absenteeism in schools with high absentees. And finally, the Firearm Injury Prevention Act has just been introduced, which this is a really interesting bill that would require continuing education on gun violence prevention for medical professionals so that medical professionals can help deal with someone, first of all, who is coming in with a firearm injury and get to how do we prevent this person from being re-victimized or perpetrating a crime themselves, but it also lets them talk to people, assess people who have high risk factors for being involved in gun violence or involved in suicide or involved in domestic violence, and help them talk to those people in an informed way. Next slide, please. So I want to thank you all for being here and for listening. And as a final point, I will just say that DC's safety very much depends on actions in surrounding states and the federal government, and we all have to work together to end gun violence. One of the most important things you can do if you're not in DC is support DC statehood, because it would give us 2 more senators that would vote for gun safety legislation and would allow us to get out from under congressional oversight for our own gun safety laws. Thanks. Any questions? Raise your hand and I can address any questions y'all might have.
Hi, Michelle, I just want to thank you. This is such an example of hands-on work, and I just really zeroed in on the safe passages and the need to help with alternatives to the violence, and with the work that LFFP does in the schools. A lot of kids will even say, if you take away my gun, you need to replace it because I need something. And so I, again, applaud and, really feel that these, very practical, specific interventions, because if we just, eliminate, I think the culture right now in a lot of places is escalating with the violence. And just again, Dunbar, I've been in there and have done peace circles, and now just such a devastation last night. And but that's not alone. So anyway, I really love and just would I feel like I just want to sit down with you and talk more about how we can partner. But anyway, thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, and for those that don't know, there was a shooting outside Dunbar High School in DC yesterday that ended up grazing a student who was sitting in her classroom with a bullet, and she will physically be okay, but I can't imagine how that whole classroom of students will feel trying to go back to school and feel safe. So yeah, I appreciate your work as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bob Cook, do you want to unmute yourself?
Sure. Thank you again, Michelle. So one of the things on the omnibus gun violence prevention about firearms tracing.
Yeah.
So my question, I guess, on that is there anything to do about ghost guns in regard to tracing, because you can't trace them? And so a part of my question on that is it illegal to even have a ghost gun, and and if somebody's found with a ghost gun in Washington, can it be confiscated from them? So anything.
Yeah. Yeah, those are great questions. DC did pass a law a couple years ago outlawing ghost guns. So it is illegal to possess a ghost gun in DC. So anyone found with a ghost gun, it gets taken away. They're not allowed to keep it. And as far as tracing goes, that the ATF is obviously not able to, because there's no serial number to trace it individually, but they can, based on the components of the gun, they can trace back to the manufacturer for some of these guns. I don't know about printable ones, but there are a lot of ghost guns are actually built from kits that are sold online by manufacturers. One of the biggest ones in the area is Polymer 80, and Baltimore has sued them because of the number of ghost guns that were recovered, that they could say these are Polymer 80 gun kit guns. And I have a feeling that we would have, it was something like 90% of the ghost guns where it came from this company. And I have a feeling DC would have similar numbers, but that's just speculation. So I think the way to go after the ghost gun problem is to go after the ghost gun kit manufacturers.
If I can just chime in on ghost guns, there, and maybe Bob Moore may want to say more about it, but the federal government proposed a rule, I think it was back in 2021, that would clarify that pieces and parts of ghost guns are guns, and that anything that you make yourself, whether from parts or 3D printing and so on, that they would have to be sold with serial numbers and with background checks. And Maryland also has a ghost gun ban. I don't know, Bob, if you have more to say about that, but that'll solve part of the problem, because it will define a ghost gun as a gun, which may seem like a no-brain decision, but it's not been that easy to move things.
Terry, I think it'd be good at this point if we just switch to your presentation, and then we can loop back to any of these issues if we have time. Thank you so much, Michelle.
Okay, thanks. Don't forget Virginia. So I'll share my screen. Uh-oh, that's not the screen I want to share. 1 second, please.
I can do it if you like, or you can do it.
Oh, well, if you have it handy, that would be great. I've been on lots of Zooms, but not using a PowerPoint. Yeah. There you go. Okay, so I've really wanted to say, first of all, that I found participating in this meeting really inspiring, and the group is definitely active, and it's nice to be among people who really care about this issue and trying our best to do something. So I'll talk about Maryland. I believe that it's going to take all of us to change America for the better and bring peace to our communities. So each part of the DMV is going to play a role, and obviously the federal government as well. And slide number 2, please. So first, I will say a few words about Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America. We tend not to use the whole title too often because it's a mouthful, but it's part of Every Town for Gun Safety, which is the nation's largest family of gun violence prevention organizations, with about 10 million supporters if we count all of the pieces. So that includes moms, mayors, students, gun owners, faith leaders, educators, and more. And just for reference, that 10 million you can compare with the National Rifle Association, which has lost some membership recently and is only about 4.4 million. So we're bigger now. And that's just the people who are under the umbrella of Everytown. So it might not capture some of the people here that work hard to for gun safety. So under the Everytown umbrella are all the grassroots volunteer networks. It's Moms Demand Action, Students Demand Action, the Nonpartisan Coalition of Mayors Against Illegal Guns, and then the Everytown Survivor Network. And I made a note. I made a note that that the nonpartisan piece of our work, we think it's really important because we don't think that trying to prevent gun violence should be a partisan issue. And unfortunately, it sometimes lines up with parties, and that's partly because of money from the National Rifle Association and other groups. But we try to be nonpartisan. So when we talk about a majority in Maryland, we say a gun sense majority and a veto-proof gun sense majority, rather than talking about party membership, even if it does tend to line up that way. And we have a gun sense governor. Now, okay, next slide, please. So we have volunteers. Moms Demand has volunteers in all 50 states. But in Maryland, we have 13 local groups throughout the state. You can see here, it's primarily, it lines up roughly with counties, but in some cases, there's the population of a particular county isn't enough to have a group. So, but you can see that it's everywhere in the state. And then our volunteers we work on state, but also federal legislative action, local government advocacy. Like just today, I was receiving information about testifying to the Board of Education in Montgomery County to try and have them take an action about school safety. And then we engage with community partners. Pax Christi is a community partner. And then with schools and through public education and electoral action. And I'll talk a little bit more about those, but I'll just go mainly focused on legislative action today. Next slide, please. And a key aspect of our work is advocating for gun safety legislation every year in Annapolis. And that involves closely following the progress of priority bills, attending hearings of votes, and staying in touch with legislators during and between the sessions. And this is a list of things that we advocate for. I'll be sharing these slides so you don't have to take notes or anything like that. Next slide, please. And before I joined Moms Demand, I knew my representatives in Congress and my Montgomery County executive and county council, but I was a little vague on my representatives in Annapolis and what exactly they were doing. But in Maryland, each district has one state senator and multiple House delegates. And having been involved for several years now, I've got a better appreciation for the importance of the state level action and process. So our next slide, please. You'll see a lot of pictures of us. Oh, wait a minute. Go back. You see a lot of pictures of us. Our annual Advocacy Day in Maryland is a one-day gathering of volunteers from all over Maryland. And we hear from our state leaders, and we also amplify the voices of gun violence survivors And then we visit our elected representatives to share our priorities for that legislative session as it is beginning. So it's usually right at the end of January. This year we had, I think this is, every year we've broken a record. We had virtual meetings during the pandemic, so we've just gotten back, I think like the last 2 years we've been in person. This year we had almost 500 volunteers at Advocacy Day in Annapolis, and we met 146 out of 188 legislators. So we're proud of the actions that we take on that day. And I wanted to say, because we were talking about in the other workshop, and our keynote speaker also talked about this, that in meetings that I led on Advocacy Day with a couple different districts, I was particularly struck by the impact of survivors telling their stories, including even some of the legislators we met with and the staff members who themselves identify as survivors of gun violence. Too many of us are survivors. Okay, so next slide, please. Let's talk about where Maryland fits in terms of legislation. And I know Bob's going to talk about Virginia. Michelle talked about the DC. Unfortunately, every town's information about the gun laws, DC is almost never in there in terms of being compared to others. So it was really interesting for me to hear from Michelle about what's happening there. So Maryland is considered to be a national leader, according to this chart here, because we have a lot of the foundational laws that are considered to be important. And Virginia, which I know Bob's going to talk about more, is considered to be making progress. And I think Maryland is like number 8 out of 50 in terms of the strength of its gun laws. If we're talking about foundational laws, some of these have already been mentioned in the 2 previous presentations, but like background checks for all gun purchases, extreme risk protection laws, sometimes called red flag laws, and secure gun storage requirements. And then we don't have as much trouble with stopping bad laws as some other states, but trying to reject laws that would talk about shoot first, stand your ground, or talk about permitless carry. The next slide shows the legislation that has been passed in Maryland since Moms Demand Action was created. And that Moms Demand was created after the Sandy Hook Elementary School shootings back in 2012. And I think if you look at this, and I'd rather just let you look at it and later so that you can think about it and how it compares with what you would like to see, and also what you see in your own state if you're from Virginia or you're from DC. So I'll focus more on, so we have the ghost guns, we have background checks on long guns, those are rifles. We've had pretty good responses to what is needed in the state. But this year we got 3, we managed to achieve 3 of our 4 key objectives. And it's a 90-day legislative session, and we had the bridge disaster that lawmakers needed to address, and some other really important things that they were working on. I think 1,000 laws were passed during the 90-day session. So our 3 getting through, we were very pleased. Sometimes sometimes it takes more than 1 year to get a piece of legislation through. So one of our hashtags is keep going. Okay, so the next slide shows you our first of these priorities that we achieved, which,
Terry,
yes,
excuse me, could we wrap it up in about 5 minutes?
yes.
Thank you.
The first one is the Gun Industry Accountability Act, and that is, this was touched on by both DC and federal. It's PLACA, and there's a part of it that says that if there's a violation of state law, then the gun industry, whether it's a distributor or a manufacturer, can be pursued with civil litigation. So this is really major. There's a few other states that have similar state laws, and we hope that that will help hold the gun industry accountable. Of course, it should be repealed at the federal level, but while it's not, states can try and take action. And I think it's important to think about that the gun industry is the only industry that is protected from litigation. No other industry is. And if you think about the impact of threat of litigation or litigation, you know, seatbelts in cars, non-smoking rules for public spaces, and accountability for opioid deaths, none of those would have been possible if those industries had been shielded from liability. Okay. So the next slide is about the Center for Firearm Violence Prevention. And that is, I think that goes to the need for coordination and also to the public health aspects of firearm violence. That was the governor proposed this, but it's pulling up together all the organizations and making sure that the resources are used in an efficient way, and it'll be housed in the Department of Health. And then the last one, next slide, please. The last one is active shooter drill notification, which which requires some different coordination about shooter drills, but also asks that all parents be notified and that all student families receive safe storage information at the start of every year. I guess I'll just go real quickly through the last slides, which is what you can do, because I know it's not what happened, but it's what you can do, and I think some of the participants might be interested. And again, that this will be shared. You can text to 64433 whether you want to join with moms, students, or survivors. So you can just sort of run through these slides, Bob, while I'm talking about that. And then there's lots of national programs, like Be Smart is the safe storage program nationally, and we're very enthusiastic to have everybody participate in that. And then I won't get into the calendar, but you can have a look at that later. And I wanted to end on, oh yeah, students. There are students demand action chapters at a lot of schools, and including at the university level. So that's another way of getting involved. And then my last, let's see, okay, survivors I talked about, and we try to honor our survivors with our action. Next slide, please. Wear Orange is gun violence awareness, and I suspect that Pax Christi is already very aware of that coming up. And then next slide. I wanted to end on a key action everybody can take, which is voting for gun sense candidates. There's a website called gunsensevoter.org where you can check any state and from president down to school board. If a candidate has filled out a questionnaire, and it's very detailed questionnaire and committed to gun violence prevention, then you know that you can reliably vote for them. And like I said, it's a nonpartisan thing, but it's commitment to this issue. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much, Terri.
My pleasure.
I'm sorry you don't have time for Q&A right now, but let me just quickly run through developments in Virginia. So the overall situation in Virginia is that Democrats have the narrowest of majorities in both the House of Delegates and the Senate, and the Republicans are opposed to the great majority of gun safety bills. So the Democrats have to stick together to get their bills passed, and that happened to an impressive degree this session. The governor is a Republican, and he hadn't said a lot about gun-related issues before the session, so we weren't sure at the start how receptive he would be to gun safety bills. The regular 60-day session ended on March 9th. A total of 100 gun-related bills were introduced between the House of Delegates and the Senate. Bills we supported outnumbered bills we opposed by 2-1. 61 bills made it out of committee. Virtually all the bills we opposed failed in committee. A total of 46 bills we supported, covering 30 issues, were passed. Most along party lines, but a few had broader bipartisan support. Overall, this was a remarkably productive year for us in the General Assembly. Unfortunately, that doesn't mean most of the bills got enacted into law. Of the 46 bills, the governor signed only 7 of them. He proposed amendments to 7 others, and he vetoed 32 bills, or 70% of the total. The General Assembly reconvened on April 17th to consider the governor's vetoes and amendments. Because of the narrow majority that the Democrats have in both chambers, they were unable to override any of the vetoes. They did deal with the amendments, which can be accepted by majority vote. They rejected his amendments to 6 bills and accepted to 1. He still has a chance now to decide whether to sign or veto the bills where his amendments were rejected. We're expecting that he'll probably veto a number of those. I'm obviously not going to go through all 46 bills, but just to give you some of the highlights. The bills that were signed included one on banning auto sears, which are little devices that can allow a semi-automatic firearm to shoot automatically. As you see, it received overwhelming bipartisan support, and the governor signed those bills. He also signed a child access prevention bill, but the wording is very narrow, so it applies only if a parent has received or guardian has received notice of preliminary determination that a child poses a threat of violence or physical harm, and the parent guardian knows or reasonably should know the child has been charged with, convicted, or adjudicated of a violent juvenile offense. We would like to say whenever there's a child present, there should the gun should be locked up, but he did sign these bills in a narrow framing. One of the bills that he amended was this ban on plastic firearms, which can evade metal detectors and ghost guns. The bills passed basically along party lines. He proposed significant amendments, removing the prohibition on ghost guns altogether and adding a knowledge standard for the manufacture, sale, possession of plastic firearms. The General Assembly rejected the governor's amendments, and as we said before, he has a few more days yet to decide what to do. Among the bills that he vetoed, the 32, were 4 pairs of bills highlighted on the next slides. All of them passed along party lines. He vetoed a ban on assault weapons and high-capacity magazines, saying that they violated the Second Amendment, that what is needed are enhanced penalties for crimes committed with firearms and greater investments in public health. He vetoed bills requiring locked storage of firearms in a residence where a minor or a person prohibited from possessing a firearm is present. He said that they would limit individuals' access to firearms for self-defense. Also vetoed were bills setting an age limit of 21 for the purchase of firearms, which the governor said violated the Second Amendment, and bills establishing a 5-day waiting period for the purchase of firearms, which he said would impede individuals facing threats of violence from promptly acquiring a firearm for self-defense. So he's obviously bought into the myth that gun possession makes people safer. In prospects for the coming year, it's an election year for the governor, offices of governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, and all 100 delegates. It's a short legislative session, 45 days. Many of the bills that passed but were vetoed will likely be reintroduced, likely be the same outcome, but it'll give the parties another opportunity to remind voters of their respective priorities. On the next few slides, I've listed resources for advocacy that you could use during the 2025 General Assembly. The first is from the Virginia Center for Public Safety, its website and its legislative tracker shown here on the right. The Virginia Legislative Information Service allows you to search for any bill by number and get a summary of the bill, the full text, any amendments, and the history, including committee and floor votes, and if it passes, any action by the governor. The Virginia General Assembly's website has several useful resources, including a search feature to get your legislators' names, office addresses and phone numbers, email addresses, and committee assignments. Most gun-related bills go through the Senate Courts of Justice Committee and the House Public Safety Committee. And if they're reported out of those committees and have any fiscal implications, they'll also be referred to the respective finance committees. So the webpage for the Senate Courts of Justice Committee lists the committee members, when they meet, and their dockets, and ditto for the Senate Finance and Appropriations Committee. And likewise, the webpage for the House Public Safety Committee lists committee members, when they meet, their agendas, and it has a link to the 2 subcommittees they have, one of which is the Firearms Subcommittee, that again lists members, meeting times, and agendas, and ditto for the House Finance Committee. So it turns out that my senator is a member of the Courts of Justice Committee, and my delegate is a member of the Public Safety Committee and the Firearms Subcommittee. So a couple of days before each of those committees or subcommittees would meet, I would look at the docket or agenda to see what was coming up in the meeting and write them, urging them to support any good bills and oppose any bad bills. And then I would follow up afterwards to see how they voted and to thank them for their support. So that was a quick run through for Virginia, and I hope it was helpful. And let's see how we're doing in our time now. All right, it's really time for our break. So Bob, maybe we should take a quick break and then come back for our closing session and any further Q&A that may be possible at that time. Thank you, everybody. And thanks again to Michelle and Terri for their excellent presentations.
So about 12:34, everybody be back. Okay. Welcome back to those of you who had made it back, and I'm sure a couple more people will be coming back soon. So what we want to do in these last couple of minutes that we have together is first get some reports from the first section workshops from our 2 leaders, and then we're just going to open it up to anything, some Q&As on that we didn't have enough time for the last session, and just anything that went on today, any sharing that anybody wants to have. So MJ, if MJ is here yet, yeah, MJ, you're here. If you could start with a little overview of our youth workshop.
Yeah, I think that we were empowered by the reports, statements of the young people who some of them had received awards from Pax Christi in the past for their work, but what was really moving is that inspired them to do more. And now they're working on their college campuses, or just behind the issue of the Israel-Palestine Gaza issue, and the whether it be legislation. One of the young people, Matt, shared about the intersection of gun violence with the other issues, mental health, homelessness, poverty, the right to education. I think the thing, and there are two Seton students shared about the work they have done in the area of advocacy, going to the legislative angle of it. I think what really moved me is the commitment, the empowerment to have a voice and to do it in community. And it really, for me, connected with Reverend Hagler shared with us that, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. started empowering us long ago. And what kind of world are we dreaming of? And so I guess I left that workshop with the voice of hope by their testimonies, by their commitment. We had a student from GW who talked about the encampments and also the police presence, and what that has done in a negative way. So Bob, you might want to tag in, but certainly it was a space. And then Luann Mostello did a very empowering sharing as one who has worked at Children's Hospital for years with children, and her awareness of the impact that these guns are robbing the lives of children all over the place. And the statistics are appalling. So I think it was a heart-filled, hopeful, call to action session. That's what I would say as a summary. But Bob, you were there and you might want to say something more.
No, that's a great summary, and we thank you, MJ, for your leadership in the workshop and your leadership over the years and decades in trying to teach our young people about peace. We really appreciate that. So, Mary, would you mind giving a overview of the session you were in?
Thanks, Bob. I would not mind. I asked Bernadette and Rose if one of them would like to sum up, and they said they were happy with me doing it. So this, I had the privilege of facilitating this breakout, which featured Bernadette Trowell and Rose, whose last name I've momentarily, Rose Pope, of course. How could I forget that? Bernadette told her personal story with a little urging, which goes back to 1987, when one of her sons accidentally killed his brother, Cain and Abel, and how she miraculously found the strength to build on that after, of course, needing support and time at the very beginning. But 37 years since that time of listening and speaking locally, regionally, nationally. She was interviewed by some major media years ago. And most important, being available, as she says, 24/7 to anyone who needs support, a shoulder, an ear, some listening, just the word that they're going to make it through somehow. The group has taken many approaches through the years, including some lobbying and such, but mainly it has been personal support for families, support for individuals. And their current plan, because they feel like they've tried everything else, is encouraging and I'm sure equipping older siblings to take responsibility for their younger ones so that everybody's in before the lights go out, before the street lights come on. So that's, you know, a practical and interesting idea I certainly hadn't heard before. Rose also lost a family member, a beloved nephew, to gun violence, and has been working with moms for a long time. And she contrasted beautifully God's extreme love for us, as shown in the scriptures she cited, with our culture's extreme greed and the way it sells dehumanizing violence for profit. She said guns are just things, people use them, and place our trust in them when we should be placing our trust in God and each other. They both emphasize that we are all beloved persons, that we have to raise up our children in the way they should go, and that, again, that fear is what we have to overcome, placing our trust in God. I think that about does it, but I know they'd welcome questions, and we certainly would. And I also want to appreciate all the other speakers and the work they've done and are doing, because there are many, we need many approaches to this enormous, monstrous problem of violence.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Mary. Appreciate that. And Mary, could you just, again, I didn't know there was a moms group working against gun violence before Moms Demand Action. So just what is the full name of the group that the ladies?
Mothers on the Move Spiritually Incorporated.
Okay.
And by the way, since both groups are women's movements, I put into the chat, Reverend Hagler said, and he's right, that 4 is the oldest peace group in the country, but Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, though it had another name in 2015, is equally long and has followed the same path. And Jane Addams was central to both of them. Yeah. Double D Addams, as I said in my text.
So this is, MOMS is an acronym. The first MOMS, okay, an acronym. But,
yes. But when we're talking about the ages are just to say that women give life and defend it and protect it, and of course men do too. But women have always been.
That's right. Now, thank you for bringing up Will. Yeah, okay. So what we'd like to do now in the next 10 to 15 minutes is really, I think, just open it up. So anybody who wants to make a comment, ask a question on anything that's been covered, or again, if you have any questions on any of the workshops or anything else, please just, if we could maybe just raise our Zoom hand, and we could just go and take whatever comments anybody has about anything today. So Maria, I see your hand up, and if you want to start us off, please.
First of all, thank you to Pax Christi for putting on this amazing event. I've learned so much from everybody here. I really appreciate the work that you're all doing. So thank you. I wanted to make a pitch for the, I think, useful information that every town has to help us identify what we call gun sense candidates. So these are the people who every town has vetted with questionnaires so that we know they support some of these gun sense legislations that Terri and Michelle and Bob have highlighted, and more. And this is a really key year for us, a very key election. Moms Demand Action is nonpartisan. We don't care if you're Republican, if you're a Democrat, if you're an independent, but we do care if you support gun sense legislation. And we need to put in place people who will advance gun violence prevention. This is a key year. So I just wanted to put in a plug for the tools that every town has, which I find very useful to inform myself about the people, regardless of party, in your state, in your legislative district, that will vote to reduce gun violence. And I've put that tool in the chat. You can copy that link, and then at your leisure, you can explore that. If you put in your address, it will show you who the candidates in your district, in your state, who have that gun sense designation are. And this will continue to evolve all the way up to the general election. So just wanted to thank everybody for all the work that you're doing and put in a plug for us to become really informed voters. I don't think there's a more important year for us to go out there and vote than this year.
Great, very important comment. Thank you, Maria. Really appreciate that. Luann, could you unmute yourself and share?
I just wanted to say that I was very impressed with the young folks that spoke, and in particular, their realization that the Pax Romana type of peace, that is cruel containment of a population, is not really peace. And that when guns come into play for keeping the peace, it is a very fine line to say that that is really peace. And I think what I grasped from those younger folks is that they were opening up their minds and looking at the bigger picture to say that the non-violence way of dealing with root causes, taking care of victims, is really the approach that is going to keep their generation alive. And it's very hopeful, you know, to have people that are realizing this. And I think the lady that was talking about her campus, the GW campus, and how it was nonviolent and the folks loved each other and were taking care of one another. And then they're presented with a force of folks that have guns, and the atmosphere changes right away. And I think this was very inspiring to kind of have folks realize what happens with the use of force to promote quote unquote peace. So I just wanted to say a thank you to those young folks that spoke up, because their stories gave me hope, and I'm sure gave a lot of the other folks hope. Thank you.
Great, Luann, thank you. MJ, did you?
Yeah, I don't know where my hand went,
Yeah,
but
that's okay.
anyway, Luann is inspiring me to say that's where I was at too. There's many forms of violence. Want to also say I'm very thankful to Moms Demand Action and Bob Moore for, you know, again, all of us need all of us to make it. So I think today's workshop was just every piece of this. But Bernadette, I don't know Rose, but I do know Bernadette from way back, and I just want to lift her up. That I saw Dorothy Day on Bob's background there, and I really feel that we all have the power to influence. You know, Bernadette long ago, with her story, with her situation, is like a ripple effect. And she has touched Little Friends for Peace Heart way back when we were doing Peace Camp at with Ray East at the parish. And I guess the other thing is all of these movements, whether it's GW, Gonzaga, Archbishop Carroll, inviting people to talk about peace in the way that Luann just said and our young woman said, that there's so much contradiction in the world. We're saying, you know, we want peace, and we're loading up armor, and we're coming in with armor. So I think it also takes so much courage, and I admire the young people. We're trying to build cultures of peace, and I hear them say, you know, it takes a lot of courage and a lot of community, and that's what Dr. King said. So thank you.
Thank you, MJ. So any others? Do other people have anything they want to share? Marie, Sister Marie.
Today was excellent. Thank you for all of it. Before I ask my question, I just wanted to comment that one thing I found hopeful in this administration, though I have my many quarrels with this administration, is that they established an Office for Gun Violence Prevention within the administration. And there are 2 young men appointed to that, and they are really good, and they're doing a fine job. So that encourages me, you know, and I hope that office will continue. My question may be for Terri, I don't know, but I live in Maryland, and I was impressed when Michelle was talking about DC, about the focus on youth intervention, because I expressed in the first workshop how concerned I am about young people killing young people. And that focus on youth intervention, I found really important. And I wonder if there's any such program in Maryland. Within 5 minutes of where I live in Greenbelt, there have been 2 recent shootings, one resulting in a death, others in injury. So I just wonder if there's any comparable program in Maryland.
I can take that really quickly. Well, I guess Maryland's pretty spread out. If you want to know about Greenbelt, I would have to check into that, unless Maria knows offhand. I don't. But there are the trauma centers in Maryland do have programs that try to connect people who come in with gun-related injuries. They try to connect them with programs, but I think you're talking about more like prevention and different ways of solving problems. Yes, there are quite a few of those things in Maryland, but there's not like one statewide one. The governor's office that was just created, that's for firearms violence prevention, they're trying to pull together all the different resources so that they can refer groups. But in Baltimore, there are definitely violence interrupters. One of our friends in the moms group has lost 2 sons. One of them was doing violence interruption when he was killed. So it's dangerous work sometimes, because it's dealing with folks that are in the milieu of using guns to try and quote solve problems. So it can be very dangerous, but it's also very important. I put my email in the chat already, but if I'll send a direct note to you, and you can remind me that it's Greenbelt and what exactly you would like to know, and I'll try to look up the answer for you. But yes, there are lots of resources. They need to be coordinated better. And prevention matters a lot.
Yeah, if I could just jump in, Sister Marie, we are doing a peace camp in Greenbelt this summer. And we did one the last 2 summers. And we also just started a peace program in a school in PG County, where we did all 8th grades, and we're doing a whole peace program. So LFFP is wanting peace education in every school, as a way of responding to the gun violence. So I'd be glad to partner with anybody here to do that. If we could get a campaign, if it's such a crisis like COVID, we should stop and equip the kids and talk about peace, just like we did today. So that's the mantra, and I'm doing it in about 5 schools in Virginia. So I'd love to hear from everybody because it's not easy to get in. But when the violence hits, then everybody's upset. But every school should start with a peace week to equip the kids and the teachers and the security guards that we are going to have a peace school and we're going to respond with peaceful methods.
Sister Marie, Bernadette Trowell.
Gotta raise your hand.
Oh, Sister Marie, Greenbelt is one of our divisions, so you can also contact me, and I'm sure I can put you in touch with somebody as well.
Who is that?
Bernadette Trowell, yes. Under my CPAAA. You're one of our divisions. I'm certainly sure I can put you with someone also.
Thank you.
And before I call on Kurt, I just want to thank Sister Marie and Sister Maria for their long time work in gun violence in different ways with Faiths United. And I know when Sister Marie helped find FAN, Franciscan Action Network, gun violence was one of the main things they've been working at ever since. So thank you for all your stuff. Kurt.
No, excuse me. No, just MJ's comment about the Peace Week. I want to reiterate that. That sounds great. And I mean, schools have fire drills. They have to have a fire drill every month. Maybe there could be something like a peace drill, so people respond maybe to things. I don't know. It just seems like, I mean, the focus is all on reaction a lot within schools, but maybe if something like that could get people to focus. Just end days, it does sound like a really good idea. I just wanted to
Great.
Voice support.
So it's at 12:56. We have 2 people with their hands up. So I'm going to say those will be our last 2 voices. So Dennis, why don't you start, and Michelle will close us out then, and I'll say a quick prayer to formally close us out.
Thank you. Just a quick comment. It was very impressive to note the amount of legislative effort that's gone into trying to change gun legislation. But none of that legislation seems to be addressed at defining what the Second Amendment is talking about. And perhaps future efforts should be based on what do we mean by guns, by weapons, by self-defense? Because obviously an individual or even a state is not allowed to have a nuclear weapon or even a cannon for personal defense. So if we could start defining what it means, maybe we can slowly chip away at some of the resistance to changing the Second Amendment in any way.
Thanks, Dennis. Michelle?
Yeah, I just wanted to go ahead and put my email in the chat as well. Specifically for DC folks that might be interested in supporting good legislation, that just reach out to me if you're in DC and you want to get involved. And I really appreciate all the comments today. And I think one person asked in the chat what makes you hopeful, or what keeps you hopeful. And for me, it's meetings like this where I see that there are so many people that are that care and are actively working towards a more peaceful country. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. So folks, again, thank you very much. And why don't we just lead us in a short prayer, and then we could say goodbye to each other for now. Creator God, we thank you for making each one of us, and for all the people who are not here with us. You make us all brothers and sisters, and we just pray that we can continue to learn how to love each other as good brothers and sisters should, Lord. And we thank you for all these good people you put in our paths. Help us to work together to make this world better. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, folks. Again, we appreciate it, and we're finished 1 minute early, so that's good. Thanks to Bob Moore and all his timing of this and all his other great work. So take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.